Welcome back to the PCA breakdown of the Spring 2026 brief. So today we're going to break down the Economics AFF. So this one is going to be more focused on the engine of development itself and argues that for developing countries, globalization is not just a policy, it's more of a mathematical and moral necessity in order to overcome scarcity. So we're going to walk through the framework, impacts, and the solvency of this case to see why normative economics is such a hard framework for the negative to beat in this case. So starting with the framework, we have some of the generic definitions that we've had, right? But we're going to really narrow down on the criterion here. So the values morality, same one that we've had for other cases, but on this one, we focus a lot more on being consistent with normative economics as the criterion. So the Collier and 14 evidence defines this really well, and it shows that economics is the study of scarcity. It's about how we have infinite wants but finite means to get them, right? So normative economics asks how we should allocate those finite resources to improve social welfare. So the strategy here is that you are telling the judge that the most moral thing that a government can do is be rational. If a policy is inefficient or wastes a country's scarce resources, then it is by definition immoral. The framework here is more of a prerequisite because you can't have human rights, stability, or focus on consequences if you haven't first solved the problem of resource distribution, which is why this Collier evidence is so good because it's really going to allow you to focus on more of the mathematical arguments for why globalization is better for the management of resources of a developing nation. Take for example, countries such as Venezuela, countries such as you know Kenya, which is a lot of the evidence cites here, which focuses on how globalization opening up the economy to open markets, globalized markets allows for more effective management of the vast resources that that country has, which in turn allows for better social welfare um, for the people of that country itself. So now we're going to get into more of the impacts of the case here, starting with the contentions, right? So we're going to start with the first contention, which is economic benefits, which kind of breaks into a couple of subpoints here. So the first one is going to be the globalizing of trade, right? So we start with this Kaya evidence, which shows that globalizing trade increases manufacturing jobs, specifically in low technology sectors, where developing countries have that comparative advantage. But really, the best piece of evidence here is this Erickson and 20 evidence, which talks way more about how protectionism fails and globalization can remedy those failures. Because when a country isolates itself through protectionism, it usually falls behind, where globalization allows countries to import technologies that they cannot produce for themselves. It's sort of a shortcut to development. You don't have to reinvent the wheel when you can trade for it. It allows for developing nations to gain better access to technologies that they wouldn't otherwise have if they remained in an isolated technological standpoint, right? So then we also get into the immigration side of things too. So specifically, the OECD 2018 evidence shows that immigration is usually a massive win for the country that is receiving immigrants, right? So in developing nations like Costa Rica and Thailand, immigrants are often more likely to be entrepreneurs than the native born population. They create jobs, they increase human capital stock, and they contribute to the tax base. But you're not going to get those, you're not going to have an economy that's attractive to immigrant workers if you're not open to globalized markets, because that's what allows mega corporations and other companies to, buy up land in those countries in order to develop to build factories, to build office spaces, to contribute to the economies there, pay taxes to the government that is over those lands. Which is why globalization can be such an attractive market for immigrant workers. That's why in the United States, which had it's starting to lean more towards protectionism, but has historically had an extremely globalized economy, has been so attractive, especially in Silicon Valley, to immigrant workers, specifically in the technology sector, because of the vast markets and the vast development that has occurred in this country because of the open markets, because companies like Apple and Google are able to have many trading partners globally um, based on their United States location. And this is further explained in the Acopler evidence as well, which we've gone over many times about how globalization boosts innovation for those countries. Also, we have this piece of evidence and evidence that talks about gender equality, which we've also gone over in this brief. That when a country is closed off, local firms can afford to be a lot more sexist. They don't have competition. But when globalization introduces international competition, firms must hire best people regardless of gender to survive, which really means that competition makes discrimination way too expensive. And as a result, globalization helps close the gender wage gap by punishing firms that prioritize prejudice over productivity. So we get into the solvency of the case itself. Why does the affirmative side solve these issues better than the negative? So there are a couple of reasons that globalization is more efficient for why globalization is more efficient for managing resources. So, first, it's breaking predatory mercantilism. So, as the 7th 2025 evidence notes, protectionism is often predatory and coercive. It relies on tariffs that hurt the very citizens that it's supposed to protect. The affirmative solves this by removing those barriers, allowing prices to drop and social welfare to rise by getting rid of those barriers to trade. Second, entrepreneurial spark. By allowing for the flow of labor and immigration, the affirmative solves the innovation gap. It brings in investors and savers who contribute to the banking system and taxes and domestic investment, and contribute to the economies and developing companies in those economies, right? Third is correcting the market. By exposing domestic industries to the global market, the affirmative solves for rent seeking, where companies get rich by lobbying the government for protection rather than making good products. So, in this case, globalization is kind of the medicine that cures the sickness of economic stagnation. So, how do we win the economics AF? A couple of points to keep in mind. First, attacking inefficiency. Whenever the negative argues for protectionism to save a specific industry, point out the opportunity cost. You might save 1,000 jobs in one factory, or you are taxing the entire population of millions through higher prices. Under normative economics, That's a losing deal. Also, focus on the gender pivot. Use subpoint C to turn the social justice debate into an economic debate. You're not just arguing for money, you're arguing that markets are a tool for social liberation that protectionism is not going to have for developing nations. Third is the productivity frontier. If the negative can't explain how a country gets new technology without trade, they cannot win the long term development argument. How do countries like developing nations in Latin America, Africa, Central Asia, how do those developing nations get access to the materials necessary for technological development? Through protectionism. Force the negative to answer that question. So this case is built on the idea that a more connected world is a more rational world, is a more beneficial world for social welfare and normative economics because it more efficiently manages the resources um, than a protectionist economy. So if you can prove that and prove why, a developing nation should prioritize globalization because it better manages its resources that way, then you're going to win the round. So finally, in the next video, we're going to get into the last affirmative, which is the justice half, and then we'll start on the negative side of things.